The phone went to voicemail 3 times in 2 days. That is when I felt fear. Thomas always answered my calls. Even when he was busy, even when his wife Lila was in the room, rolling her eyes. Always. If you are watching this, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. If you and mother teaches you a new kind of feeling, call it instinct. Call it worry. When something is wrong, you know it in your bones. I had felt that for weeks. My name is Evelyn Martin. I am 68. 3 months ago, my biggest worry was whether to plant tulips or daisies by the porch. Then the phone calls became fewer. The Sunday dinners stopped. Thomas was always punctual with a call. That changed after he married Lila Hayes in a small June wedding. Mom, Lila thinks we need new boundaries, he told me the last time we spoke, 2 weeks ago. He sounded different. Hollow, like he read from a script. We want our own family time. That is what she called, pushing me out of his life. I called his office. Sunrise Carpentry. This is Janet. Hi, I'm Evelyn Martin. Is Thomas in? A long pause. Mrs. Martin, he has not been in for over a week. We thought he took some days off. My hands shook. Thomas never took vacation without telling me. He was orderly, like his father. Did he call? Leave a message. No, ma'am, we have been trying to reach him. They needed him for a big roof job. I thanked Janet and hung up. A week gone, and I only found out now. What kind of mother does not know when her child disappears? The kind whose son married a woman who made cutting people out an art. Lila was perfect at the start. Clever, polite, pretty. She knew little things about my garden and praised my stew. Dorothy, my neighbor, said after meeting her once, "She is acting, watch her." But Thomas was so happy. He moved so fast with Lila. They were engaged in 2 months. Small wedding, just family, they said. I kept quiet. 3 days later my phone lit up. Lila. My heart hit the floor. Evelyn, this is Lila. Her voice was flat, like a script read in a clinic. I'm calling about Thomas. I thought she would cry. She did not. He's gone, Evelyn. A car crash on Route 88. He died 3 days ago. The phone slipped from me. Dead, my child. I asked where the funeral was. It was yesterday. Close family only. He wanted it small. Close family only. She spoke as if she sold life insurance. She said Thomas wanted privacy. Thomas would never have wanted to exclude his mother. Not ever. I called again. She did not answer. I called his friends. Blank faces. Mrs. Martin. Are you sure? Tom. Thomas's friend, asked. No accident reported. That was worse than anything. I called the county sheriff, the coroner, the highway patrol. Ma'am, I need a case number or a date. June 11th, Route 88. I waited. No traffic deaths under that name, on that date. My kitchen froze. No death certificate. No accident report. Either Lila lied or Thomas was not dead. I bought a plane ticket to Phoenix that same afternoon. If she wanted to keep me away, she would find out that I would not go quietly. On the plane, I planned. First find their address, then get answers. They lived in a tidy neighborhood called Desert View. Mediterranean-style houses, neat lawns. Lila's new SUV sparkled in the drive. I sat across the street and watched. Through the window I saw life. Someone was home. My doorbell rung sharp when I stepped on the porch. Lila opened the door. Sundress. Sunglasses. No red eyes. She looked ready to lunch, not to mourn. What are you doing here? She asked. I came because my son died, and I was told he had a small funeral. She checked behind her like a performer, checking the audience. You can't just appear. We're grieving. Where is he buried? I said. Oak Hill Cemetery. She said it quick, then tried to close the door. I stepped forward. Show me the death certificate. Her face barely changed. You are not next of kin. I was his emergency contact for 28 years, I said. When did he change that? After we married, she said. After 4 months. Of course. The living room was staged. Clean lines. No pictures. No cards. No flowers. I donated most of his things, she said. Donated? A woman who lost her husband 3 days ago had already erased him. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I drove to Oak Hill Cemetery. The clerk said there was a plot in Section H, number 312. There is a temporary marker, he said. Name and date, printed. I walked to the plot. Cheap plastic nameplate. June 11th, 1989, 2024. The ground looked the same as the surrounding grass. No fresh earth. When was this buried? I asked a worker. He frowned and checked his log. That is odd. No record of a burial last week. We show just a pre-need purchase. Pre-need. That is when a person buys a grave in advance. I walked back to Lila's house with a cold head. At night, I called hospitals. Nothing. No records. I called the sheriff. Detective Martinez listened. Ma'am, without a body or proof, there is not much we can do. Someone buried my son. In a plot that shows no burial, I said. She lied. She is hiding something. He warned me to be careful. I told him to check a storage unit. I thought they used. The next day, Lila drove to Secure Lock Storage. I followed. Unit 312. She left empty-handed. Then she drove to the airport. I bought a seat on the same flight, but she vanished between security and gate. I had a panic that she would get away. I called the detective at the gate. He said he had a warrant and would check the unit. When the police opened the storage unit, their faces went pale. Thomas's things were there. His watch, his wallet, photos. But that was not the worst of it. There were folders. Fake marriage documents, old names, insurance policies, names that changed like coats. The detectives called it a pattern. It was not the first time this woman had done this. They found records of other husbands dead under strange circumstances. A name repeated in many files. Lila Hayes. Also used Anna Gray. Laura Reed, Sarah Vaughn. Years, marriages, deaths. The detectives said they had found several husbands who died after a quick marriage. They found Thomas's body out in a remote wash near Sunridge. He had been dead for weeks. Poison. A toxin that acts slow and hides like a disease. My throat closed. I had called him when he tried to call me. He had tried to reach me. He had been sick and reaching for his mother. I was not there. The detective said Lila had a real name, Margaret West. She used masks. She moved fast. She left town when things got hot. I sat in the station and felt raw. I had found him too late. But the detective said something that cut a small light in the dark. Mrs. Martin, because you did not accept the story, we found patterns in her past. You stopped her. You helped us save lives. I could not sleep for weeks. I could not go home to my empty kitchen and the garden I had planned. I wanted to hunt her, but I had never done that before. I was a retired librarian. I kept order, kept lists. That list had helped me find a killer. I spent the next days with the police team. The storage unit had more than Thomas's watch. It looked like a small office for a criminal. There were boxes of fake IDs, passports, and marriage certificates from different states. There were envelopes with cash. One box had old letters signed with many names. In a clear bag was Thomas's ring. It was the same ring he wore in his college photos. It had been at his burial, then it was in a storage unit, then it was in a bag marked evidence. The sight of it made me sick. Detective Martinez sat me down. He was patient. He explained what they found. Mrs. Martin, she used multiple names for years. She married men quickly. Within months, she would be the beneficiary on a life policy or would have control of their accounts. Where there was a sudden death, she benefited. He showed me charts with names and dates. I traced my finger across the line that included Thomas. The killer had a type. Older men who lived alone or were newly widowed. Men who were generous and soft. Men who wanted company and closeness. I found one surviving husband, he said. James Hale. He nearly died. He is alive in Oregon. He told us about how she seduced him. I wanted to go to Oregon. I wanted to tell that man she had killed my son. The detective told me there was more to do. This woman would move fast. If she saw me, she would run. She had an escape plan. She kept a list of safe places. Rental units, storage spaces, friends. That was why I had to hurry. I learned she used poison. That is hard to find. It mimics natural illness. At first, the victim is tired. Then they lose weight. They cough. Doctors assume it is age or stress. By the end, it is too late. The pathologist who checked Thomas said it could only be found by specific tests. She had covered her tracks. People had called it tragic. The detectives called it murder. We found a pattern of donations in emergencies. She told friends she could not keep things because memories hurt. She talked about moving on. She arranged small funerals. She spoke about privacy. She controlled the story. That pattern showed that Thomas was not a single case. The storage unit also had a small camera, a laptop, and a note with names and dates. The list had towns across the West. I learned she did not act alone in every case. Sometimes she had help. Names on the list included thin notes about meet in cafe, change plates, cover story. That meant someone helped with the details. Someone found men for her. Someone placed ads or spoke at grief groups. I need to know who helped her, I said. If there is a partner, they must be stopped. Detective Martinez nodded. We are tracing bank transfers. We are looking for people who helped her change names. But this woman was smart. She rented with cash, and she was careful with electronics. I could not sit and wait. I wanted to see her face. I wanted to know why. I went to every cafe she used, every salon, every grief group in town. I watched photos of her. I studied how she smiled. You would not guess she was a killer. She looked kind. But the photos showed a pattern of moving on fast. Always at the center, with a grieving man. A neighbor told me she had seen an ambulance come to their house. No one watched the rescue. The paramedics loaded him up and left. The neighbor thought he was ill. That neighbor had not known he was poisoned. The paramedics had no reason to test for poison. Years of work had taught me one thing. Predators hide in ordinary moments. I started to think differently. I thought like someone who plans. I tested my patience. The police set up a small team in Portland, where I lived. They said they would try to catch her. I studied the files. I volunteered my time, looking at names. The detectives were grateful. They said I was valuable because I recognized patterns. Detectives did not always see. One day we found a name. A man in his 50s in the paper looked lonely. He owned a small import shop. Robert Chen. He had lost his wife a year ago. He was a match. The detective said, we might use him to catch her. I felt both fear and relief. I did not want another man to die. If Robert would help, we might trap her. We asked Robert to play along and not reveal she was under suspicion. He agreed, after long thought. He had been talking with a woman online who used the name Rebecca Lane. She wrote sad messages and said she understood his pain. Robert said she made him feel safe. He let her into his life. He had not married her. Not yet. We planned small things. Robert would record conversations. Officers would watch from nearby. We would bring paramedics and antidotes just in case. We wanted to catch her. When she crossed the line, Margaret did not stay idle. She sensed pressure. We watched as she began to rush the idea of marriage. She started to speak of moving in. She spoke of updating legal names. That is when we knew she felt the heat. Predators act faster when they fear discovery. The night of the planned dinner was the hardest night. I sat in a small van with the team. My hands would not stop trembling. The feed from Robert's body mic was clear. Our hearts beat with every word. Margaret arrived with a casserole and a bottle of wine. She smiled and talked about the future. She made him nervous with flattery. Robert played his part exactly. At one point she left the room to the bathroom. We moved. Officers came through the back door. Robert dumped the wine into a container as the paramedic checked the casserole. The feed showed a powder being mixed into the food. My stomach lurched. This was not chance. It was deliberate. When the officers moved in, Margaret changed faces. On the surveillance feed, her smile vanished. She hissed, "You tricked me." She was handcuffed soon after. She shouted and cursed. Her mask dropped, and her eyes went wild. For a moment, she looked afraid, then cold. They led her away. In the days that followed, more evidence came out. We found bank records that matched the burial purchases, the travel, the storage units. We found a file naming men and cities. The pattern spread like a net across years. I cried at night. I went to the station in the morning. When they told me she had been charged with several murders, I felt relief like rain after drought. But relief was thin. Thomas would not return. Still, I kept reading notes and attending court. I watched the detectives work. The files in the storage unit had given them the lead they needed. The list that seemed like trash became proof. After the arrest in Phoenix, the case moved quickly. The news called Margaret a serial bride. Everyone wanted details. I had to be careful with the press. They asked me to say things that hurt. I gave only the facts. I thought of Thomas and kept my voice calm. I told them to respect families. Some reporters were kind. Others smelled drama and wanted more. The police in Oregon found a surviving husband named James Hale. His story helped build the case. He said she had poisoned him slowly, but he lived. His testimony was strong. It made the pattern clear. She did not always kill quickly. She waited until she had the right setup. The detectives found other men on the list from the storage unit. Names rolled across pages on the evidence board, like a map of hurt. They found 3 more deaths that might be linked. Some had been labeled natural, others were accidents. We asked for retests. Modern science could find what previous doctors had missed. I read the reports and learned a new vocabulary: toxicology, metabolites, half-life. These were words I never thought I would know. In court, the defense tried to say Margaret had been made a scapegoat. They said long-term relationships die naturally. They said her ties to men were normal. The prosecutor had blood tests and bank transfers. They had recorded conversations. The list in storage had too many threads to ignore. I sat in the front row when the trials began. I wanted Margaret to meet my eyes. She watched the courtroom like it was a stage. She met me once. I saw no remorse. Only a small flicker of fear when the jurors looked at her. It made me angry and quiet. I went home to the small garden and planted the tulips I had delayed. I thought of Thomas making me laugh when he was young. Detective Martinez thanked me often for pushing the case forward. He said other detectives had been stuck for years on small, odd deaths. "You saw the pattern," he told me. "Most people miss it." I did not feel special. I felt empty. But the work gave me a place to put my pain. We found evidence of at least 6 men killed over 12 years. Margaret had used many names and many states. She moved like a weather front, fast, changing, dangerous. The lawyers called it premeditation. I called it a life of lies. One night I found a small leather notebook in the storage material. It had lists of flowers, hotels, and small places. She wrote down restaurants and the brands of vitamins her victims took. It was chilling. She planned small details and wrote them like shopping notes. It showed how careful she was. When we thought the trail had ended, a detective called to say there was another lead in New Mexico. A small-town man had died after a short marriage. The family had accepted it as bad luck. Now, with a new lens, they were not so sure. The cold case team wanted to take another look. I said yes. I agreed to help. The police asked me to look through archives and to read old newspapers. For a retired librarian, it felt natural. I scanned microfilm and read obituaries late into the night. Occasionally, I would find families who had small notes and yearbooks. They would send me photos and handwritten letters. I would read and remember that each file had a life behind it. As the list grew, so did our burden. We matched names with dates, with funerals, with insurance payouts. Each match was a little victory. Each victory also opened old wounds. I sometimes thought I would drown in it, but then Dorothy would call with soup, or Robert would send a short note to say he was okay. Those small things kept me moving. At a hearing, one of the families came forward. A woman in her 70s said a man in her town had died and they had thought it was an unlucky chain of events. Now she had hope. That was the reason I kept going. Not for the headlines. Not for the court. For families who deserved to know. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Witnesses told of dinners, of quiet moments, of the laughter that came before the silence. A doctor testified about poisons that mimic illness. An investigator showed the storage unit photo with folders like a map. The jury listened to Robert Chen speak in a clear voice. He told the truth about love and betrayal. He named the small things that made him trust her. When the court read the verdict, my hands were still guilty. Guilty on most counts. The judge looked at Margaret and sentenced her to life. She stared at me with something like a grin. It made my stomach flip. But the handcuffs clicked and she walked away. For the first time in a long time, I felt a thin line of relief. After the trial, Detective Martinez offered me a new role. "Will you work with our cold case unit?" he asked. "You have an eye for patterns. You helped crack this." At first I laughed. Me? A retired librarian? But the idea settled like a seed. I had spent months reading files and making lists. I had learned to look for what others did not see. If I could help other families, then the pain would not be empty. I said yes. 3 weeks later, I sat at a big table at the office with other detectives. They called me a consultant. I called it a second chapter. The first day they gave me a file from 2012. A man had died, and his wife, now living under another name, looked like a match. I dug in. I read and pulled threads. Each case I opened felt like a small door. Sometimes it led nowhere. Sometimes it led to truth. The long work of matching names, bank accounts, and odd marriages continued. For the first time after Thomas, I had a place to put my grief. I turned it into something that mattered. After joining the cold case unit, I settled into a new routine. Mornings were for reading old files. Afternoons were for phone calls with families who still had questions. Nights were for thinking and remembering Thomas. The work kept me busy, and busy helped the ache feel less sharp. One day Detective Martinez brought a new packet to my desk. It smelled faintly of dust and coffee. The paper was thin with age. The death had been ruled natural at the time, but there were notes that made the original detectives uneasy. The victim had been a widower named Harold Green. He had been 70, lived alone, and had been lonely after his wife died. That fit the pattern we had seen with Margaret. His file had a small note. Possible foul play. Check bank transfers. I traced my finger along the page and felt the old spark of focus. I started with the bank. Old records can be messy, but they sometimes hold a key. In Harold's case, I found checks written to a woman whose name I did not know at first. The handwriting matched other checks we had seen before. That was enough to move the case forward. We reopened it. There were risks. Reopening a case can raise hopes, and it can also bring pain. I spoke with Harold's daughter on the phone. She cried softly when I told her we were looking again. "We always wondered," she said. "He kept saying he wanted company. Then one day he was gone." She sent me photographs from Harold's life. A hat in one, a faded wedding picture in another. Human things. I read every note and felt the worth of the work. Detectives set up a quiet plan. We needed to catch whoever might be visiting men who matched Margaret's pattern. We needed to move slowly, like a hunter who knows a trap must be patient. We spoke with local grief groups and volunteer centers where lonely men sometimes met new people. We tested the pattern against names and times. The net grew slowly. We used a small team and a few volunteers. Robert came to help with interviews. Dorothy brought cookies and a sharp eye. She liked to read faces and did not miss a flinch. Her notes were simple but useful. She would say, "Look at her hands," or "Notice how she says we're when it should be." Those small cues mattered. One clear lead came from an obituary in a nearby town. A man named Leonard Shaw had died 2 months after marrying a woman he met at a community center. He had been healthy. The death had been sudden. The community had called it a sad ending to a short marriage. I read the care notes and the nurse's record. There were mentions of stomach problems and a slow decline. We asked the county to retest preserved samples. Science moves faster now. Old files can reveal new truths. While the lab rechecked samples, we watched. We built profiles for local volunteers and new members of the grief group. The woman who had been with Leonard showed up in some photos from the center. She smiled in group pictures. Her name was Rebecca Lyle. The name clicked with the list in the storage unit. Some names repeat like echoes. We did a quiet background check. Rebecca had changed addresses often. She had no long-term job history. But we also found rental receipts that matched the pattern of small moves. We found a used car purchase. It all added up to someone who kept a low trail. It was time to plan a controlled meeting where we could observe without scaring people. We set up a community lunch at the center and invited volunteers. The lunch would be a safe space and a chance to see how Rebecca moved among people. Police would be there in plain clothes. Cameras would be positioned in common sight. The goal was not to trap her publicly, but to watch for behavior that matched what we had seen before. On the day of the lunch, my hands went cold. My stomach tightened as I watched people enter. I sat near the door with Dorothy and Robert. We sipped tea and watched. Then she walked in. She was smaller in person than in the photos. Her smile was perfect. She moved like she wanted to belong. She found a table and sat near a man alone. My chest tightened. Detectives watched her every move. She spoke kindly, touched shoulders, leaned in close, as if to share a secret. She listened. She made people laugh. That is how she worked. Not by force, but by the slow closeness that makes someone drop their guard. We took careful notes. After the meal, she offered to help an elderly man with his coat. Dorothy pretended to fumble with a napkin and moved closer. She watched one thing closely: how she handled food and drink at table. Did she insist on washing the dishes? Did she touch a man's cup? These details have meaning when you know the pattern. For Margaret and for others like her, the path often began with small touches. We had what we needed for a small follow-up: a friendly phone call to Leonard's daughter to see if Rebecca had been over for dinner, and a check of the man she had sat beside that day. Within a week, her pattern became more obvious. She had reached out to an older volunteer via private messages. She suggested tea at his house. The volunteer was new to the group and flattered. He agreed. This was the moment that tested our plan. We did not want to stop the kind and vulnerable from finding company, but we also had to protect them. We set up a monitored visit. Officers shadowed from a distance. Robert wore a wire in a stable house where we could intervene, not to trick but to ensure safety. A paramedic and an antidote kit were on standby. Rebecca arrived with a casserole and a gentle voice. She praised the man's life, asked about his late wife, and leaned in as he talked. She poured tea and he drank. The camera picked up the motion, a small movement at the edge of her plate as she dusted a powder into the cup. My hands shook when I watched the live feed. This was the moment we had to act. Officers moved in that night with quiet speed. No loud arrests in a public space. They took her from the house before any harm reached the man. She struggled and hissed at the officers. She was careful for years, but not careful enough. That night we had a second arrest. Another woman brought to justice. Another life that might be saved. After the arrest, we found a small notebook on her. It had names and dates. It had a short note: "Fast is safe." That line made me cold. It matched the list in the storage unit. We had found a branch of the same pattern. At the station, detectives lined up photos. One by one we matched names to faces across 2 states. The net expanded. Each match brought more grief, but also proof that our work mattered. Families called us with a small light of hope. Some cried on the phone and thanked us. Others were silent. The work was slow, but it had meaning. In those weeks I stopped sleeping like before. I read files late. I would wake and write notes. But there were also good moments. Robert sent a letter saying he would start counseling. Dorothy brought me a pot of stew and insisted I rest. Small acts kept me steady. The case had become a part of me, but it was not all of me. When the prosecutors faced the new evidence in court, they had more than a list. They had a pattern of behavior: bank transfers, records of burial purchases and storage units, and audio recordings from the houses where women had tried to poison men. That evidence made a strong case. The day Rebecca went to trial, I sat near the front again. The judge looked at the papers and watched the witnesses. When the verdict came guilty,
A soft exhale escaped me. Each guilty verdict was a small victory for everyone who had lost someone or had been close to losing someone. I planted the tulips that spring. Each bulb felt like a small promise. The work in the cold case unit continued. Each lead we followed was a seed that might bloom into truth. Sometimes those seeds took years, but I had learned patience.
When one arrest happens, ropes linked to it can reveal other ties. After Rebecca's detention, detectives found a string of emails and a list of contacts across state lines. She had names of men and addresses, but she also had messages to people who booked rooms and transferred cash. A network slowly came into view. Someone had been helping her by finding lonely men or by setting small scenes that made meeting them easy. Tracing those messages required time and patience. The lead detectives, a few forensic accountants, and I worked through stacks of bank statements and email logs. We mapped patterns. A hotel reservation here. A rental paid in cash there. A car purchased around the same time as a burial plot. The more we looked, the more it felt like an uneasy web stitched across years. One morning, an analyst found small transfers, $300 here, $500 there, sent to a nameless account from multiple cards. The account belonged to a company with a thin paper trail. We subpoenaed the bank and pushed. A clerk in a small town remembered a man who came into the office with cash to buy prepaid gift cards. That trace led to a mid-level runner named Eric Miles. Eric turned out to be someone who stitched together logistics for predators. He rented apartments, made small buys, and sometimes created fake identities for a fee. He had no direct wish to hurt anyone. Money drove him, but money made him a dangerous accessory. When detectives tracked him down, he agreed to speak in return for a lesser sentence. The story he told opened a window. He named places and people, told us about how he met Margaret, and explained how she paid for the neat paper trail. He described the careful way she chose men, places she frequented, how she made them feel special, and how she avoided attention. He said she was professional and cold. She paid him to make logistics smooth. He had no idea the toll until the news broke. Eric's testimony was a turning point. It helped link old cases where a mysterious rental or a prepaid card had been dismissed as a fluke. Now those details looked like a pattern, a map showing where predator and runner crossed. We dug deeper into the accounts and found other people who had unknowingly enabled schemes for years. The courtroom battles that followed were not simple. Prosecutors had to connect the money and the movement to the deaths and the poisoning. Motives and money trails are easier to show than intent, but we had a string of connecting facts. Detectives used Eric's testimony to show how often Margaret had moved after a death, how often she cleaned apartments, how often she bought burial plots in the same way she arranged flights. Families of victims sat in the gallery. Some cried quietly. Others sat stone-faced. I spoke with many afterward. One woman, whose husband had been far from home when he died, told me she had never suspected that someone could be cruel enough to pretend love while preparing to end a life. The pain in her voice was familiar. It was part of the job that no one trains you for the responsibility to carry their stories forward. I learned more about how predators like Margaret use small steps to disarm their targets. She used sympathy, then promises, then the slow delivery of care that looked like love. In the background, people like Eric smoothed tasks. None of them made the killing, but the chain of actions made murder possible. As the network unfolded, we found other names. Some were small-time helpers, like runners who rented rooms with cash. Others were more complicated. A woman in a neighboring state had opened accounts and given addresses for a fee. She claimed she knew nothing and said she had been duped. We had to test these claims carefully. Sometimes the law catches people who enable crimes. Sometimes it does not. We relied on confession, evidence, and the careful work of tracing transactions. It was tedious and slow, but it was also necessary. The chain was long, and every link mattered. Meanwhile, the family started to gather. We created a small support group where people could talk about the men they had lost. It helped. When the court gave us a window of hours to speak with families, I would go and listen. Their stories added small details we needed. A favorite dinner, too many casseroles, A travel plan changed the day before. Those simple facts helped match patterns thousands of miles apart. During those months, I met a young investigator named Lena, who had an interest in online patterns. She taught me how to follow social media breadcrumbs, a message deleted here, an account opened there. The net had gone digital in many ways. We traced messages on grief group pages and found a man who had been writing to dozens of women under fake names. The online paper trail gave us more evidence and more courage. That online work connected us to a woman in Spokane who had lost a husband years earlier. Her case had been labeled natural until we found hours of messages between her and a woman with a different name. When new tests were run, the cause of death shifted from natural causes to suspicious. The family was both grateful and stunned. The work changed my view of grief groups. These were places of healing, but also places predators could exploit. So we partnered with community centers to offer safety tips. Slow down, verify, ask for friends to meet new companions, and keep meals public until trust is clear. Those small changes saved lives later. In court, the prosecutors used the network map to show how carefully Margaret had woven her pattern with help. The jury saw how people she paid helped set the scenes, and how messages coordinated times for visits. That link made her reach across states and years. It showed the scope of the harm. As the cases unfolded, I went back to my garden and pulled weeds. It was a simple task that steadied me. I thought often of Thomas, and of the thin line between a neighborly smile and a sentence on paper. The work we did was not only about catching criminals, it was about making sure families knew the truth that mattered. The courtroom hearings stretched over months. Each day we brought in witnesses, bank clerks, delivery drivers, apartment managers, and the small-time runners who had once helped with cash or cars. Each voice built a picture that was patient and terrible. Many of the witnesses were ordinary people who had only done small jobs. They suddenly realized their role in something larger. At trial, the prosecution laid out the timeline of events. They placed Margaret and her helpers at the scenes. They showed photos from storage units, receipts for burial plots, and recordings from wiretaps. One by one, the pieces fit together. One of the most painful parts was hearing about the last days of men like Thomas. The prosecution read his last messages to me and others. They showed how he had tried to call for help, and how his calls came more often as he got weaker. It was like a slow fade that no one had seen as violence at the time. A forensic toxicologist explained how ricin and other similar toxins can mimic chronic illness. Left unchecked, he said, these compounds look like age or stress. He showed charts of liver levels and metabolites, words I had never used before. Metabolites, half-life, enzyme markers became plain and terrible in meaning. The jury listened in silence. Witness after witness spoke of the small domestic scenes, casseroles, tea with too many pills, an insistence to move in, a quick talk about wills. The pattern felt like a script repeated with different actors. It was chilling and terribly clear. When the jury returned a guilty verdict, the courtroom released a long-held breath. Margaret sat with shoulders tight. She looked small and furious in equal measures. The judge sentenced her to multiple life terms. There was no parole. The sentence was a kind of closure for families who had waited years for answers. Even with the sentence, new questions came. The network had holes. Eric had named people who might have helped, but not everyone came forward. Not all the receipts matched a place. I realized our job would continue for years. Cases reopened like doors that did not fully close. After the trials, I was asked many times to speak about the work. I visited community centers and libraries. People came to hear how to spot patterns and how to protect loved ones. I learned to speak without collapsing. Telling the story was hard, but telling it meant fewer people might fall for the same lies. The cold case unit continued to work. We reopened files that had sat untouched for a decade. Modern tests gave answers where there had been only suspicion. Families who had lived with a question mark finally saw clarity. Not all answers were neat. Some tests were inconclusive, but each reopened file gave us a chance to bring truth. I also began to write down what we learned. A A small manual for community leaders and grief groups, how to run background checks on volunteers, how to keep meals public, how to notice small signs of control. These were not legal tools, but small common-sense steps that help reduce risk. Sharing the manual felt like giving back. Through all this, my life changed in small ways. I still had moments of quiet when Thomas's memory came, like a sudden ache, but the work gave shape to the grief. I met other families and saw how their lives continued in small, bright ways. Robert Chen sent a card 1 year later. He had begun a small volunteer group for men. He had found slow and steady friends who were not threats. That note warmed me. 1 year after Thomas died, we held a small remembrance at Oak Hill. A new headstone now took the place where the temporary marker had been. I wrote words on the stone and read them aloud. Friends, family, and some of the detectives came. We planted roses near the grave, a small living thing to grow where loss had been. Detective Martinez said that our work saved more than the arrested people. "You taught us to listen differently," he told me. He meant the detectives. He also meant me. The way I watched and the way I questioned had made a difference. I thought of that and kept going. When I think back to the first time that the phone went to voicemail, I still feel that cold, but I also feel a slow warmth. A warmth from people who stood with me. A warmth from small victories that mattered. The work of the cold case unit continued. Lives moved forward slowly, and the gardens we planted grew. I still wonder sometimes about how one person can carry so much and keep going. Maybe it is stubbornness. Maybe it is love. For me, it was being a mother who could not accept silence about her son. For others, it was the detectives who would not close a file, the neighbors who spoke up, and the small communities that learned to watch for small signs. In the end, the truth was messy and long. The court made a decision, but the work did not stop. We kept looking, we kept asking, and when we found answers, families got pieces of peace. That is why I stayed in that office late at night, reading old files by the lamp. I wanted to make sure Thomas's story was not forgotten, and that other stories would not end the same way. Even after the trials and the arrests, there were loose threads to follow. Eric Miles had given us a name and a pattern, but he had also said one line that stuck with me. "She never worked alone." That nagging phrase pulled at the edges of the cases we had closed. If someone had helped her find victims or launder money, then the danger might not end with one woman behind bars. Detectives Lena and Martinez pushed to follow Eric's contacts. He had small notes in his phone, nicknames, places, and a recurring reference to a fixer in the Midwest. The word fixer is small and vague, but in the right hands it meant someone who made problems disappear. We traced booking receipts, flight logs, and the small prepaid cards Eric had used to hold deposits. The paper trail moved slowly, but it moved. One name kept appearing in odd places: Daniel Price. He was not a villain in the sense movies show. He was careful, quiet, and very good with paperwork. He ran a small business in Ohio that helped people set up trusts and do modest legal work for elderly clients. He did not have a flashy life. He had a clean office, a polite voice, and a neighbor who brought him coffee. That is the kind of person predators use. Someone who blends in and makes things legal. We found a receipt that had both Daniel's business stamp and a prepaid card code that matched transfers we saw in Margaret's files. The account showed small payments to Daniel for an odd list of services: name change assistance, document forwarding, and temporary storage. Nothing illegal on its face. But when you stitch together a dozen of those records across states and add them to the other evidence, the picture shifts. Detectives subpoenaed Daniel's records. He protested at first. He said he had only helped with mail forwarding and had no idea who Margaret was. But a young auditor on the team found a ledger with names that matched the storage units and fake identities. Daniel had written initials and dates in a small, neat hand. When confronted, he finally admitted that he had provided services to people who wanted to disappear or to hide assets. He said he did not know the real purpose at first. "People say they need privacy," he told us. "They talk about moving on. They tell me sad stories. I thought I was helping them start over." The word helping stung. He had been a quiet part of a cruel machine. He had enabled disappearances and helped create legal walls for those who meant to harm. In the courthouse, Daniel looked small and tired. He had no dramatic scenes. He had paper and deniability. Judges give less mercy to people whose work becomes the tool of harm. His testimony opened new doors. We found more records of small services that had once been dismissed as clerical tasks. A forwarding address here, a notarized signature there. Those notes now looked like parts of a plan. We found phone calls Daniel had logged late at night. We found hotel reservations with cash payments. The small pieces were no longer random. When prosecutors connected him to multiple cases, the town where he lived was stunned. People who had known him for years came forward to say they had never suspected he was part of something like this. He had been quiet and kind. That quietness made the betrayal worse. Meanwhile, back in Portland, the cold case unit used the new leads to reopen files in other states. Old autopsies were checked again. Saved blood samples were tested with modern methods, where once there had been no cause, but natural fingerprints of poison sometimes appeared. It was painstaking work. It took months, but every match was a victory. We were giving families truth where there had been shadows. One afternoon, I was at my desk when Lena came in with a new envelope. Inside were photographs and a receipt dated 8 years earlier. It had the logo of Daniel's company. It showed a purchase of prepaid cards and a shipment to a motel in a town where a man had died and been buried as if it were a quick tragedy. The photo showed a woman who looked like Margaret in a different haircut. The faces were the same behind variations. The connection was clear. I spent long hours reading the files and cross-referencing names. I worked with Lena and with an analyst named Omar, who could pull years of phone data into a neat map on his screen. It was amazing and terrible to watch. The map lit up like constellations, lines connecting cities, names. Each blue dot on Omar's screen had a story behind it. The network had many weak links, small-time helpers, people paid for services, and messy human needs that predators exploited. Yet when we tightened the net, it showed how harm travels in small legal steps until it becomes a crime. The law moves more slowly than bad actors. We had to be clever. We had to look where no one had looked before: the quiet office, the prepaid card receipt, the lonely man who welcomed coffee from a new friend. At one hearing, a woman testified who had once helped book rooms for clients without asking questions. She came to court and cried. "I thought I was helping them get a fresh start," she told the judge. "I never thought someone would die." Her words were simple but true. She had not meant harm, but she had been part of the system that made it happen. Daniel was convicted for enabling the crimes. He was not the mastermind, but his legal help allowed the predator to move and to hide. The sentence was not light. The judge said the law must protect the vulnerable, and that even small actions can have big consequences when used to cover crimes. One of the hardest parts of the work was telling families that a helper had been found guilty. People wanted to name a single monster. They wanted a clear beginning and an end. But the truth is messier. Crime can involve many people who did not fully understand until it was too late. Our work was to make sense of the mess and give names and accountability to all who had a role. As the network unraveled, some men came forward with stories of near misses. One man said a woman had been staying with him and he had felt ill. He had thought it was stress. He was alive because he had a relative who insisted he go to the hospital. That relative pushed for tests. The tests saved his life. Those stories felt like small miracles. They also reminded me of why we had changed community practices: slow down, take meals in public, ask a friend to be present when new partners visit. I kept working, reading files and taking calls. Each lead we followed gave us another possible name to check. Families called me to say thank you. Some were still angry. Others had found relief in knowing the truth. I learned to hold each emotion without trying to fix it all. Months after Daniel's sentence, a detective called to say another small-time runner had agreed to testify about how he helped move funds. These tiny confessions
created a pattern that prosecutors used to show how wide and methodical the scheme had been. It was almost like watching a slow machine break down, gears grinding until the whole thing stopped. When a final arrest came in another state for a man who had been moving victims' mail, I sat in the parking lot of the station and felt the sun on my face. The work was not over, but it had grown teeth. The net was stronger. The families had more answers. In my pocket, I held a small photograph of Thomas, one I kept in my wallet. I touched it and felt both the ache and the steady, strange peace that comes from doing the work. It did not make the loss go away, but it made the loss mean something. We had not only caught the person who killed my son, we had found the chain that made the killing possible. That truth was heavy and important. It let families bury not only a body, but a secret.
A year after Thomas's death, life had changed shape. The cold case unit carried a steady list of new leads. The arrests and trials had stopped some predators and exposed others. Our small manual on safe practices had been shared with centers and groups across the state. It was not a cure, but it was a start. I still missed the small things. Thomas's laugh in the kitchen, his dry jokes at holiday dinners, the way he would come by with a packet of seeds and ask which flowers I wanted. Those memories lived in my hands when I planted. I had planted the tulips the spring after his death. That autumn I planted a line of roses where he used to help me build a trellis. The roses grew slowly, pushing through the dirt with a stubborn, quiet strength. When they bloomed, I thought of small truths. Time continues, but so does memory. The roses were both a garden and a promise. Each spring I would prune, water, and watch. It felt like a small repair of the edges of my life. The office at the cold case unit became a new habit. I read files and met families. I spent afternoons at community gatherings teaching short lessons. Bring a friend when a new person comes to dinner. Slow down decisions about merging finances. Check small details. I also learned to say no when the work became too much. Dorothy would call me at odd hours and scold me for staying late. "You have to sleep," she would say. "You are no good to anyone tired." Robert Chen started a support group for men who had been lonely and who wanted company without risk. He invited neighbors and friends to bring sandwiches and talk. His group was a small, everyday success. "It helped me not be alone," he wrote me in a note. Those small victories were as real as any courtroom win. The cold case unit solved 8 cases that year. Families came to the office and hugged detectives who had listened for so long. Some people thanked me with tears. Others offered nothing. They did not all want to be friends, and that was okay. We had given them knowledge, and sometimes that was enough. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, we held a small memorial at Oak Hill. Family, detectives, and a few friends stood in a circle. I read a short piece I had written about him. I spoke simply. "You were my son. You called me with small news and big plans. I missed you on the day you needed me." I did not speak about revenge or justice. I spoke about the small things, the roses, the calls, the quiet hours. Detective Martinez stood beside me. He had changed his tone over the months from professional to friend. He told the crowd about the detectives who kept files open when others closed them. He gave a gentle nod to everyone who had helped. It felt like a passing of a torch. We had used pain to make a tool to help others. Margaret and her helpers would spend years in the legal system. A few more trials would happen, more names mentioned, more families waiting. The work would continue. That knowledge sits with me like a steady stone under a river. The water moves on, but the stone stays. I still answered emails from people who had questions. I sat on panels for community safety and wrote an article for a small journal about recognizing patterns. My days were not free of grief, but they had purpose. That purpose kept my hands busy and my mind steady. Sometimes, in the quiet garden at dusk, I would sit on the bench Thomas had made when he was young. A soft wind would move the roses, and I would think of his hands, the way they moved when he worked with wood, or when he held my hand in the supermarket. Grief is a shape we learn to carry. It becomes part of who we are. For me, it became a kind of labor to make sure the story of my son did not stop with a lie. Months later, A detective called with news about a cold file in another county. The tests had found traces of a toxin in a body that had once been called natural causes. The family wanted to know. I went to the meeting. The look on their faces when we showed the test results was small and sweet, a piece of peace folded into their life. That is what mattered. At night, before I turned off the lamp, I sometimes said aloud the things I had not said at the funeral. I am sorry I did not answer every call. I would say, I will keep watching. I will keep asking. Saying those words did not change the past, but it made the future feel less like a blank night. If you are listening to this, and something feels odd, a loved one pulling away, a pattern of small things that do not add up, trust the feeling. Ask questions. Call a friend. Let someone else listen. That small step can change everything.